The divorce documents shook in my hands as I studied my husband's face, not with sorrow or remorse, but with the strain of holding back a grin. "I'll be taking everything that's mine," I said calmly. His lover exhaled in admiration of my designer home, unaware of what tomorrow would reveal. Empty houses never lie. My name is Veronica Ashmore, and I had been planning this moment for 11 months, 2 weeks and 4 days. Not because I am a woman who counts days in grief. I had stopped grieving around month 3 when I found the second burner phone tucked inside a tennis bag that hadn't seen a court in years. I counted because I am a woman who counts everything. That is what made me good at my job, and more relevantly, that is what made me exceptionally good at leaving. The house at 14 Whitmore Lane had been mine before it was ours. I had purchased it at 29 with a signing bonus from my second year as a senior financial analyst at Crestwood Capital. It was a narrow Victorian on a street lined with oak trees so old they cracked the sidewalk every autumn, and I had walked through it alone on a Tuesday afternoon in October and decided, without negotiating, to pay the asking price. My realtor had looked at me with a mix of professional admiration and personal concern. I hadn't cared. The kitchen had northeast light, and the study on the 3rd floor had a window seat wide enough to sleep on, and I had wanted it the way you want something when you are 29 and finally earning enough money to want things cleanly without guilt attached. I had married Daniel Ashmore 4 years later. He was charming in the specific way that men who have never been told no tend to be charming, effortless, a little careless, beautiful in the jaw and the shoulders. We had met at a fundraiser for an organization I no longer remember, and he had leaned against a column near the bar and watched me talk to 3 different people in succession, and then said, when I finally circled back to refill my glass, "You're the most competent person in this room and everyone can tell." It was a strange thing to say. I had found it irresistible. We had been married for 6 years when I found the phone. 6 years of dinner parties and a shared savings account, and arguments about whether to renovate the kitchen, and a miscarriage in year 3 that we had never quite talked about enough. 6 years of a life that looked, from the outside, the way a life is supposed to look. Daniel worked in commercial real estate. He was good at it without being brilliant, which suited him. He liked to arrive at parties slightly late and leave slightly early and have opinions about wine. He had never once in 6 years asked me a question that required more than 2 sentences to answer. I should have understood something from that. I understand it now. The woman he had been sleeping with was named Cassandra Bell. I found her name in the phone, which I had found because I had been looking, not with suspicion exactly, more with the particular attention I bring to things that have begun to feel slightly off, the way a column of numbers draws your eye when one figure doesn't belong. Daniel had been slightly off for 4 months before the phone. A new distance in the mornings, a new alertness when his personal cell buzzed, a new habit of showering immediately upon arriving home, before he even poured himself the drink that had previously been his first act upon crossing the threshold. I had found the phone on a Wednesday. I had spent exactly 48 hours deciding what to do with what I'd found. Then I had called my attorney, a woman named Phyllis Okafor, who had the office on the 6th floor of a building downtown, and the kind of reputation that makes opposing counsel slightly pale. I had not cried in Phyllis's office. I had brought a manila folder containing my notes, dates, behaviors I had observed, photographs I had taken on my own phone, and I had laid it on her desk and said, "Tell me what I need to do." Phyllis had looked at the folder, then at me, and said, You've already done half of it. Here is what people who have never been through a divorce don't understand. It is not the ending of love that is most disorienting. It is the ending of a shared version of reality. For 6 years, Daniel and I had inhabited a story together, and that story had a shape, a house, a social life, a future that was vague but assumed. When I found the phone, I did not lose Daniel. I lost the story. And that particular loss requires a kind of mourning that has no clean ceremony, no casseroles brought to the door, no socially sanctioned weeping. You just have to sit inside the collapse of the narrative and figure out who you are when it isn't true anymore. I had done that sitting, mostly alone, mostly in the window seat on the 3rd floor, with a cup of tea going cold beside me, in the weeks after I found the phone and before I did anything about it. I had sat with the grief of it, which was real, and I had sat with the anger of it, which was realer, and I had sat with the slow, clarifying question underneath both. What do I actually want? What I wanted, I discovered, was the house. Not out of sentiment, not as a symbol. I wanted it because it was mine, because I had bought it and paid for it and chosen it and loved it for 11 years, and because it had northeast light in the kitchen and a window seat wide enough to sleep on, and because Daniel had never once looked at it the way I looked at it, which is to say he had never looked at it with the specific tenderness of someone who had chosen it freely, without compromise, when they were 29 and newly capable of clean wanting. The house was mine before the marriage. Under our state's property laws and with appropriate documentation, it would remain mine. Phyllis had confirmed this in her calm, deliberate way, walking me through the relevant statutes while I took notes on a legal pad. The equity we had built together over 6 years was a different matter, and there were other assets to negotiate. The joint investment accounts, the vacation property in the Berkshires that Daniel had inherited from his father, certain questions about pension contribution periods. But the house at 14 Whitmore Lane was legally and practically mine. Daniel did not know this, or rather, Daniel had the kind of vague, comfortable assumption that men who've never had to think carefully about money tend to develop, which is that things work out. He assumed, I imagine, that a divorce would be negotiated from a position of rough equality. He assumed that his name on the deed added 3 years into the marriage, a gesture I had made in a moment of feeling that a marriage ought to look like a marriage, would mean something more than it did given the prior ownership documentation. He assumed, most fundamentally, that I was going to be too sad and too stunned to be strategic. He had never understood that the two things are not mutually exclusive. You can grieve and still be strategic. You can love someone and still be clear-eyed about what they owe you. In fact, the clearest thinking I have ever done in my life has happened under conditions of significant emotional duress, which is maybe a strange thing to know about yourself but is useful. When I finally told Daniel I wanted a divorce, it was a Sunday evening in November, and Cassandra was sitting on my sofa. He had brought her to the house, my house, on a day he believed I would be at a work conference in Philadelphia. I had come home a day early because the conference had ended, and I had opened the door to find them drinking wine in my living room, Cassandra's feet tucked up on the cushions that I had selected from a fabric swatch book on a rainy Saturday 3 years ago. She had very good bone structure and the kind of wardrobe that suggests someone who thinks carefully about how they want to be perceived. She stood up when I came in. Daniel had gone very still, in the particular way that Daniel goes still when a situation has gotten away from him. I had not shouted. I had not thrown anything. I had set my overnight bag down in the hallway and walked into the living room and sat in the chair across from the sofa, and I had looked at Daniel for a long moment, and then I had reached into my bag and removed the folder that Phyllis had prepared, and I had placed it on the coffee table. "Those are the divorce documents," I said. "I've had them ready for 3 weeks." Cassandra made a small sound. Daniel looked at the folder and then at me and said, with a kind of desperate normalcy, "Veronica, I'll be taking everything that's mine," I said. My voice was entirely steady. The effort required to keep the smile off my face was honestly considerable. What Cassandra couldn't know, what she was busy not knowing with her wine glass and her elegant cheekbones and her proprietary study of my living room, was that the house she was admiring and every beautiful object in it was in the process of being relocated. Not physically, financially. Over the preceding 11 months, I had been quietly, methodically, and entirely legally restructuring my assets in ways that Daniel had not noticed because Daniel had never been particularly interested in the details of our finances. He knew roughly how much we had and roughly where it was, and had never, in 6 years, read a single statement that arrived in our name. This was one of the ways I had known, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that we were differently configured as people. The joint investment account had been rebalanced. The contributions to my personal retirement accounts had been maximized. The documentation establishing my prior ownership of the house had been gathered, notarized, and delivered to Phyllis's office. A valuation had been conducted on everything I cared about keeping. I had done all of this while continuing to cook dinners and attend Daniel's colleague's birthday party and have the kind of quiet, functional conversations that constitute the texture of a marriage in its final months when only one person knows its ending. It had not made me feel cold. I want to be precise about this because I think there's a tendency to assume that clear-headedness in the face of betrayal means the absence of feeling, and that is not accurate. I had cried extensively, in private, mostly in the car, which is where I do my most unguarded feeling. I had called my sister Marlo at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday and talked for 2 hours about nothing and everything, not telling her the specific thing, but telling her enough that she had driven up from the city the following weekend and taken me to a terrible movie and a good dinner, and not asked me any questions I wasn't ready to answer. I had felt it all. I had just also been organized about what I needed to do. The divorce proceedings, when they formally began, were not what Daniel had imagined. He had hired a lawyer named Todd, who was expensive and had good hair and had probably never encountered a woman with a manila folder the size of mine. The negotiation lasted 4 months, during which Todd and Daniel gradually came to understand the dimensions of the situation, which were that the house was mine, that the documentation was airtight, that my prior ownership was unambiguous, that the question of the added name on the deed was legally minor given the circumstances, and that Phyllis Okafor had encountered this type of argument before and had a precise and quietly devastating way of addressing it. We settled in March. I kept the house. Daniel kept the Berkshire property and his car and his share of the joint accounts, which was fair and which I had calculated carefully to be fair, because I am not a person who wanted to punish Daniel. I wanted to be free of him, and I wanted what was mine, and those are 2 different motivations that lead to 2 different behaviors in a negotiation. Punishment requires ongoing attention to the person you want to punish. I wanted to stop paying attention to Daniel entirely, and the most efficient path to that outcome was a clean and fair settlement. He moved out on a Saturday in late March, and I watched from the window seat on the 3rd floor as the moving truck idled on Whitmore Lane and men carried boxes through the front door. He had not taken much. The furniture was mostly mine, chosen by me, bought largely with my money. He had his clothes and his books and a few pieces he had brought from his bachelor apartment in the early days of the relationship. A record player, a leather chair that had always looked wrong in the living room, a collection of architectural prints he'd bought on a trip to Barcelona before we met. He had looked up at the house once before he got into the car, and I had moved back from the window before our eyes could meet. I had a glass of wine that evening, alone in the kitchen, with the northeast light going gold and orange as the sun dropped, and I thought about what it means to be returned to yourself after a long time of being divided. It is not triumphant exactly. It is something quieter and stranger, a kind of settling, like a foundation going still after a tremor. You breathe differently. The rooms feel different when you walk through them, not larger or smaller, but more precisely themselves, as if they've been adjusting to your specific presence in the way that old houses sometimes seem to do. I had thought I might feel lonely. I had prepared for loneliness the way you prepare for weather, stocking the house with things that would help me through it, scheduling dinners with Marlowe and with my friend Georgia, making a list of things I had wanted to do and hadn't done during the years of the marriage. A trip to Lisbon, a furniture restoration class, more mornings in the window seat with a book and no particular agenda. Loneliness, I had decided, was not the worst thing. Loneliness was honest. Loneliness didn't borrow your tennis bag to hide a phone in. What I hadn't prepared for was the relief, the specific physical, bodily relief of living alone in a place that was entirely yours, where every object had been chosen by you or by people you invited to choose, where the temperature and the silence and the schedule were yours to set. I had forgotten what that felt like. I had forgotten that I had ever lived that way, which is one of the stranger losses of a long relationship, the forgetting of the self that preceded it. You don't notice the forgetting while it's happening. You only feel it in the returning. 3 months after Daniel moved out, I signed a new contract at Crestwood Capital. I had been promoted, a thing that had been offered once before, and which I had declined at the time because Daniel had been considering a job opportunity that would have required us to relocate, and I had waited to see what would happen with that. It hadn't happened. We'd stayed, and the offer had not come again until now, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a meeting with my managing director, in which she outlined the terms and watched me across the desk with the expression of someone waiting to find out whether she'd read the room correctly. She had read the room correctly. I took the role, Head of Portfolio Risk Analysis, a title I still find slightly startling when I see it in my email signature, not from false modesty, but from the honest surprise of getting a thing you had wanted so long that wanting it had become a habit rather than an expectation. I hired 2 new analysts. I restructured a department that had been, under my predecessor, organized in a way that made sense on paper but created friction in practice. I worked very hard, which I had always done, but now without the low-level guilt of a person who suspects she is working hard partly to avoid being home. In the months between the settlement and the autumn, I did a number of things I had not done in years, small things mostly, the kind that accumulate into a life without announcing themselves. I cooked elaborate dinners for no occasion. I rearranged the living room twice, moving the sofa and the chairs and then the books until the room felt right in a way I hadn't been able to articulate before, but recognized immediately when I arrived at it. I called my mother more often. I took long walks on weekend mornings without a destination, just following whatever direction the light seemed to favor, ending up in neighborhoods I didn't know well, and spending time in coffee shops where nobody knew me, and feeling in those anonymous hours something I can only describe as the pleasure of being precisely oneself without anyone watching. I also spent a great deal of time in the study, which had become, in Daniel's absence, more fully itself. The books reorganized, the desk cleared of the accumulated residue of compromise, the reading chair moved closer to the window where I had always wanted it, and where Daniel had always found it impractical. I read things I had been meaning to read for years. I started a small journal, not a diary exactly, more a record of observations, things I noticed, questions I had, the occasional sentence that seemed to be reaching for something I couldn't yet name. I had not written anything for myself since graduate school, and the strangeness of it was part of the pleasure. I went to Lisbon in September. I went alone, which I had never done. Traveled alone, I mean, not for more than a night or two, and always for work. I had booked a small apartment in the Alfama district, up a hill steep enough that the walk home from dinner qualified as exercise, and I had spent 6 days walking and eating and sitting in cafes with a book and being nobody in particular in a city that didn't know me. I had thought I might be lonely there, and I was sometimes, in the brief way that solitude produces loneliness when you are in a beautiful place and have no one to turn to and say, "Look at this." But mostly I was happy in the way that I have only ever been happy alone, which is a happiness that doesn't require anything of you and doesn't require you to perform anything, and which has a flavor I can only describe as clean. On the fourth evening, I ate dinner at a small restaurant near the river and talked to the woman sitting next to me at the bar, an architect from Helsinki named Siri, who was in Lisbon for a conference and had, like me, wandered into the restaurant alone and ended up in conversation over a shared bottle of wine. We talked for 3 hours about our work and our cities and eventually about our lives, the way strangers sometimes allow themselves to talk when the geography makes it safe, when you know you will not see each other again, and so there is no social cost to honesty. I told Siri about the divorce. She told me about a professional partnership that had ended badly and a move she had made against all advice, from a prestigious firm to starting her own small practice, and the years of difficulty and the eventual surprising steadiness of it. "You did the hard part," she said at some point in the evening, and I wasn't sure whether she was talking to me or to herself. But I nodded anyway, because it seemed true of both of us. I flew home on a Sunday morning and took a taxi from the airport and unlocked the front door of the house at 14 Whitmore Lane, and the smell of it, old wood and the specific dust of old books and the faint trace of whatever I had been burning in the fireplace before I left, hit me in the chest in a way that surprised me. Home. It was just home. I had made it home again, truly, for the first time in years. The following spring, I had the kitchen renovated. I had been wanting to do it for 4 years, and Daniel had always had reasons not to: cost, disruption, the timing of various other projects. I hired a woman named Dara, who had been recommended by Georgia, and who came to the house with a notebook and walked through the kitchen asking questions before she offered a single suggestion. We agreed on a plan over 2 meetings and implemented it over 6 weeks, during which I worked from the dining room table and made coffee on a camping stove and ate a great deal of takeout. The new kitchen had northeast light, the same northeast light, of course, only now coming through windows that were larger, framed differently, oriented to maximize the morning and bouncing off surfaces that had been chosen to catch it. I remember standing in it on the morning it was finished, with the workers gone and the last of the dust settled, holding a mug of coffee and watching the light move across the new countertop, and thinking about myself at 29, walking through this house for the first time, knowing immediately and without negotiation that I wanted it. Thinking about all the years between that self and this one, the marriage and the grief and the 11 months of quiet preparation and the divorce and Lisbon and the new title and the new kitchen, thinking about what remains consistent across all of it, which is the wanting, the specific and personal wanting that has always known under everything what it requires. I told Daniel that November evening with the documents on the coffee table that I would be taking everything that was mine. I had meant it precisely. Everything that was mine, not as punishment, not as greed, but as the accurate description of an intention to reclaim cleanly and completely the life I had built before it was ours and the self I had been before I tried to make myself half of something. Cassandra had exhaled that evening with the particular appreciation of a woman recognizing beautiful things in a room. She had looked at the furniture and the books and the art on the walls, a painting I had bought from a gallery in the East Village in my late 20s, a ceramic piece from a potter in upstate New York, a botanical print inherited from my grandmother, and she had seen what anyone would see, a home that had been put together with care and knowledge and the accumulated aesthetic confidence of someone who had been paying close attention to what she loves. She had not seen what I saw, which was evidence, 11 years of specific choosing, every object a small record of the self I had been and the self I had continued to be, even in the years when I'd been slightly submerged. I did not know very much about Cassandra Bell beyond her name and the fact of her presence in my house. I had deliberately not sought out more information, because I understood from the beginning that she was not the point. The impulse to research a spouse's affair partner, to study their social media, to map their life, to measure yourself against them in ways that will make you feel either better or worse depending on the day, is one I had recognized in myself and redirected, not because I was incapable of petty curiosity, but because I knew where it led, and it did not lead anywhere I wanted to go. She was younger than me by perhaps 5 years. She was beautiful in a particular, composed way. She had good taste in the narrow sense of knowing what signals to send with her clothes and her posture. She had chosen Daniel, which told me something, though I wasn't entirely sure what. I had thought about her once late one night in January, lying in the dark of the bedroom that was now simply mine again, and I had tried to feel what I was supposed to feel: betrayal, rivalry, the particular gendered humiliation of being replaced, and I had found underneath all the other more reasonable feelings something closer to pity. Not for her circumstance, but for what she couldn't know, which was the same thing Daniel couldn't know, which was what it costs a person to build something slowly and carefully over 11 years, and what it means to have that thing taken as a given by someone who arrived after the building was done. The house had kept that record. Empty houses never lie, and full ones keep their own accounts. Every room in the house at 14 Whitmore Lane was fluent in a language that only I could read, and what it said in every northeast angle of light and every worn edge of the window seat and every book on the shelves in the study where I still sometimes fall asleep reading was, "This is yours. This was always yours." You knew it the first time you walked through the door, and you were right. There is a particular conversation I had with Marlo, my sister, in the months after the divorce was finalized that I have thought about often since. She had come up for a weekend, and we had spent Saturday evening on the back porch with a bottle of wine, and the kind of openness that only comes after years of being close and also after something has been survived. She had asked me whether I was angry, and I had thought about it genuinely before answering, which is something I have always appreciated about Marlo. She asks questions as if she actually wants to know rather than as a prelude to the answer she has already prepared. I had told her I wasn't angry, not anymore, and she had looked at me sideways with the specific expression she reserves for statements she's not entirely convinced by. I had tried to explain it more precisely. That anger had been part of it, certainly. The first months had been largely anger, but that anger is fundamentally forward-looking in a way I'd had to remind myself of. Anger wants something. It wants acknowledgement or justice or change. And once I had understood what I actually wanted, which was the house and the life and the reclamation of the self I'd been before the years of being half of something, the anger had gradually converted into something else, something more like fuel, a clean energy source without the smoke. Marlo had poured us both more wine and said, in the tone she uses when she's saying something true, "You're going to be insufferably okay about this." And I had laughed, which was the first time in months that laughter had felt entirely like itself and not like an effort. I know what Cassandra saw that evening, and I know what she could not have imagined about the following morning, when she would return to her own life and discover that the house she had briefly coveted, the designer home with the art and the books and the light, had been legally, financially, and entirely secured against any claim that was not mine. I was not cruel about it. I did not want her to suffer. I wanted her to understand, in whatever way she would eventually understand it, that there are some things that belong to a person so completely and for so long that no secondary claim can really touch them, and that such things are worth the patience required to protect them. The divorce documents had shaken in my hands that evening, not from grief, not from fear, but from the sustained effort of holding back everything I already knew. I had known for 11 months. I had moved carefully and legally and without malice, and I had done it alone, in the specific solitude of a woman who has learned to trust her own assessment of a room. Daniel signed in April. Phyllis called me on a Thursday afternoon to tell me, and I said, "Thank you," and hung up and sat for a moment at my desk at Crestwood Capital with my hands flat on the surface, feeling the particular quality of an ending that is also a continuation. Not a new chapter. I've always found that metaphor slightly false, as if life were more episodic than it is, more like a clarification, like a room with the windows finally opened, the light coming through clean and sharp, showing you exactly what was always there. I went home that evening and made dinner in the new kitchen and ate it alone at the kitchen table and watched the last of the afternoon light work its way across the countertop and down the wall and finally disappear. And I felt, as clearly and fully as I have ever felt anything, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The oak trees on Whitmore Lane were beginning to bud. In a few weeks they would be full and green and would start cracking the sidewalk again, the way they did every year, the way they had been doing since long before I bought the house and would continue doing long after I was gone. Old and indifferent and obstinate in the way that living things are obstinate when they've been in one place long enough to know their own roots. I liked them for that. I had always liked them for that. Veronica Ashmore, 39 years old, head of portfolio risk analysis at Crestwood Capital, owner of a Victorian house with northeast kitchen light and a window seat on the third floor wide enough to sleep on, raised her wine glass to no one in particular in the new kitchen and did not say anything aloud because there was nothing that needed to be said. Everything that needed saying had been documented and signed and filed with the county clerk's office. Everything else, the grief, the clarity, the long, patient work of reclaiming herself, lived in the house around her, in every object and surface and angle of light, telling its quiet, accurate story to anyone fluent enough to read it. She finished her wine. She washed the glass. She turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs to the study on the 3rd floor, and she sat in the window seat and opened her book, and the street below her was quiet in the ordinary way of a spring evening, and the oak trees were beginning to bud, and outside the window the last of the light was doing what light in this city does in April, which is to linger past the point of reason, past the point where you expect it to finally give up and disappear, insisting on itself right up to the edge of the dark. She read until 11, which was later than she'd intended, and then she set the book face down on the window seat beside her and looked out at the street for a long moment, at the trees, at the lit windows of the houses across the way, at the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of being here, in this house, in this life, which was hers. She had taken everything that was hers. It was more than enough.